I'm thankful for my wife on many levels, but one of them is that she anticipates things I don't, things that don't even come on my radar. And she says that, hey, haven't you thought this? And I'm like, yeah. Well, then shouldn't you? And I'm like, oh, that's called wisdom, taking what you know and figuring out how to apply it. And I've watched her do that many times, and I've been blessed by the exercise of that wisdom. God is wise. In fact, God is all wise. And God exercises his wisdom in the things that he does with regard to our salvation, our past salvation, our present salvation, our future salvation. And Paul, as he kind of draws to a close these thoughts that he's had here, going back into verse 25, that he says, now to the one who is able to establish or make you stable, according to my gospel, which is according to the proclamation concerning Jesus Christ, it's the same thing, according to the revelation or the unveiling of a mystery, which has been kept secret in long ages past, but now has been made plainly visible or disclosed, even through the scriptures of the prophetic scriptures, which we looked at, in accordance with the commandment of God, or with his order. He's given the order. It's time for this to be revealed now. Pull it out of the file cabinet and let people know the commandment of the eternal God. See, God is an eternal God. He's not bound by time, but that doesn't mean that he has not planned certain things to happen at certain points in time. And there was a point in time he had already determined way, way back in the past, long before anything existed, that he was going to reveal this command. And he says it's been made known then to all the nations for an obedience of faith, which we talked about yesterday. Not an obedience then from fear, but an obedience that comes from faith, from having that faith that causes us to say, hey, my relationship is solid with God because it's based on God's work and on who Jesus Christ is, not based on how well I perform. That would be a law way. And so Paul then says to the verse 27 here, if I can get this to scroll up here, to the only wise God through Jesus Christ is glory forever or into the ages. But to the only wise God. Now, why does he say wise God? Why does he bring this up? Because as Paul looks at this plan, how God stabilizes believers, we wouldn't think that this is the way they would stabilize them. In fact, I go back and I read, just last week I was reading in of the reformers, people that would identify themselves in the Reformed faith and those that would be in the Wesleyan branch of the Reformed faith. And they both kind of come out the same way, many of them. And that is that there is stability for the Christian only so far as the believer is living properly. And since a lot of believers are up and down in their Christian life, their stability is up and down. And it totally messes up the way we live by faith. And it totally then means that when we obey, oftentimes those kind of believers obey out of fear, trying to perform well enough so that they can have an assurance and a stability and all of these things. And yet Paul is saying, no, our stability is based on who Jesus Christ is, and that alone. It's not based on our performance. And not all believers come to appreciate that, but some do. And contrary to popular opinion among some Christians, those that come to appreciate that normally don't go out and cause all kinds of problems and live in horrible, immoral fashion, whatever things you might put in the end of there. They normally don't do that. Normally they are so overwhelmed by God's grace and the stability that's brought on by God's grace that they actually live to God's glory because of that. Interestingly enough, in Ephesians chapter 3, which we've looked at this, I believe, last week, in 3:9, where he's talking about this administration, or if you remember, this house rule, this way of life. This is God's way of life for us, which back in Ephesians 3:2, he says involves God's grace. And Paul says part of his charge was to bring to light what is this administration of this mystery. And again, this is not the gospel. He's not bringing to light the gospel. He's bringing to light the riches of the Christ. He's bringing to light for believers all that God has done so that we might really enjoy the relationship that God's given to us. And as we're seeing in Romans, that believers might be stable. In Ephesians, Paul has some other purposes, and one of them is bringing believers together that are having a little bit of division issues. And he says this administration or this house rule, or as I was raised, this dispensation, and it's not of the mystery, it is a mystery. This administration was a mystery, which for ages has been hidden with God who created all things, so that, in verse 10, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known through the church. Let's just stop there. Manifold wisdom of God. This word manifold that we have down here, it means multifaceted. A manifold in an engine is a place where you have several chambers that come out of one thing that's common, and it takes maybe fuel, it maybe takes exhaust, it takes air, and it brings it into specific places, and it takes it from one, splits it into many, and or many into one. It's manifold. And they call that a manifold in an engine, but manifold in English simply means diverse. It's not just one. So there's not just one exercise of the wisdom of God. So if you look back in history, for the 1500 years leading up to the time of Christ, Israel had lived under the law. And they might think that God's wisdom really involved largely the obeying of that law. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, he says, this is your wisdom, Israel, the law. The law. They didn't have to go out and seek another kind of wisdom. That was their wisdom. For us, he's showing that there's a manifold wisdom of God. Interesting thing is a lot of times when we're coming to Christian life, when you start talking about grace, one of the questions that sometimes Christians ask are, well, how far, since we're under grace, how far can you go? You know what that is? They're going back to law because they want to know, where's the line in the sand that I can go that far but no further? See, that's not grace. That's law. See, because they want to know where the boundary is. They want to know where the precise no is. And we go right back to that. And so when he's looking at this wisdom, this manifold wisdom of God, he says he's making that known now through the church. So it doesn't just that we're learning about this manifold wisdom of God, but then it goes on, this manifold wisdom of God through the church to the rulers and authorities that are in the heavenly places. And when he's talking about this rulers and authorities here, he's talking about spirit beings. We popularly call them angels, but they're divided into different categories. And these categories are rulers and authorities. In other words, the angels, as they're watching what God's doing with you and I down here today, by grace, in Christ, causing us to become stable and live to his glory, not out of fear and not out of trying to earn something, simply because he's been so rich to us in grace, as Paul says here in Ephesians. Rich to us in Christ. They're learning something else about God's wisdom. In fact, I would say they're learning other things about God's wisdom. They're realizing God's wisdom there's not just one thing to it. There's manifold aspects to his wisdom as he applies these things to us. It's an encouragement for us to realize we have this wise God that with all of his knowledge, everything that he knows, has taken that knowledge and has designed our salvation in such a way that we can be stable as we come to appreciate what he's done, what he's doing, who Jesus Christ is for us right now, and who that means we are in Christ. All the time, no matter what our conduct is, none of this changes. Because this is all God's work. And it causes us to grow, it causes us to be stable, and it causes us, when we understand that properly, to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you so much for joining me today.